important stuff. Okay, so just right into it. President Eisenhower had the chance to lead significant change in race relations, but his reluctance to do so was definitely his biggest failure as president of our country. Time magazine noted in 1958 that the country needed his moral leadership to fight segregation, but he didn't really take on that role. Although Eisenhower supported civil rights in principle and made some progress, like desegregating public facilities in D.C. and ending discrimination on military bases in Virginia and South Carolina, he avoided making civil rights a central issue during his presidency. And like many white Americans, he underestimated the frustration and anger of African Americans and feared provoking resistance from Southern whites. He believed that pushing too hard would only deepen racial tensions, and two key beliefs shaped Eisenhower's approach: his preference for state and local control over federal action, and his doubt that laws could change racist attitudes. And as a result, the Supreme Court, rather than the President or Congress, led the way in civil rights. And in 1953, Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, expecting him to be very conservative. However, Warren turned out to be a very strong advocate for social change, and Eisenhower later regretted the decision, calling it the biggest darn fool mistake I ever made. Under Warren's leadership, the Supreme Court became a driving force for civil rights and political reform for the next couple of decades. So, whenever we have a big, important Supreme Court justice like Earl Warren, we will typically refer to their time period as whatever their last name, court. So we refer to this period as the period of the Warren Court, right? It's just, that's all it is. Like, it's nothing, other than this was a very impactful Supreme Court justice and Chief Justice. So we call it that, right? Okay, so the leaders of the early civil rights movement emerged from the very communities most affected by discrimination: African Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans, and others. And amongst them, African Americans played a central role in what would become the most significant social movement of the 20th century. They fought for their rights through legal challenges, voting right efforts, and public demonstrations. Although many African Americans had moved to northern and western cities, the majority still lived in the South, where segregation remained deeply entrenched. In the 1952 presidential election, for example, only about 20% of eligible black voters in the South were registered, and that reflected the barriers that they faced in exercising their rights. Public schools were also segregated under separate but equal doctrines established by the Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision. However, in reality, black schools were often severely underfunded, lacked resources, and suffered from things like overcrowding. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, began challenging this doctrine in the 1930s, arguing that segregation inherently created inequality, and it took nearly 15 years of legal battles to make significant progress. A major breakthrough coming in the Sweet versus Painter case in 1950, when the Supreme Court ruled that the separate black law school in Texas was not equal to the state's white-only law schools. The court ordered Texas to correct this inequality, marking an important first step towards dismantling legalized racial segregation throughout the United States. Now, by the early 1950s, civil rights activists were challenging state laws that required racial segregation in public schools, and 5 cases from Kansas, Delaware, South Carolina, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. were combined into one large case and brought before the Supreme Court under the name Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Typically, we just call it Brown versus Board of Education. President Eisenhower tried to avoid the case, even telling the Attorney General he wished that the court would delay it until a new administration took office. But when it became clear the justices were moving forward, Eisenhower privately urges Chief Justice Earl Warren to side with segregationists. Warren firmly rejected the pressure, telling the president, "You mind your business, and I will mind mine." On May 17, 1954, Warren delivered the unanimous Supreme Court ruling that declared, in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. The court relied on sociological and psychological research presented by civil rights lawyers, showing that even when segregated schools were equal in facilities, the act of separating students by race created feelings of inferiority amongst black children. A year later, the court ordered the school integration should proceed with all deliberate speed, but the decision made it clear that racially segregated schools could no longer hide behind the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling. The Chicago Defender, a leading black newspaper, called the decision a second Emancipation Proclamation and said it was more important to democracy than nuclear weapons. Despite this ruling, Eisenhower refused to publicly support or enforce it. He even declined to condemn the brutal 1955 lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till, a black teenager from Chicago who was visiting family in Mississippi. Till had allegedly whistled at a white woman while buying candy at a store, and days later a group of white men kidnapped him from his relative's home, beat and tortured him, and then shot him. They tied a 75-pound cotton gin fan to his neck with barbed wire and threw his body into the Tallahatchie River. His face was so disfigured that the mortician urged his mother to keep the casket closed, but she refused, saying, "Let the world see what they did to my son." Over 100,000 people would view his body at the funeral in Chicago, and an all-white jury quickly found the accused men not guilty, though they later admitted to the murder. The case shocked the nation and became a turning point in the civil rights movement, as Nobel Prize-winning author William Faulkner, a Mississippian himself, condemned the murder, writing that if we in America have reached that point when we must murder children, no matter for the reason of or what color, we don't deserve to survive, and we probably won't. By the mid-1950s, violent resistance in Mississippi and other parts of the South made it clear that dismantling white supremacy would be a long and difficult struggle, while some northern and border states, like Kentucky and Missouri, began integrating schools as early as 1954. The Deep South and Virginia strongly resisted, and Southern lawmakers pushed back against the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, claiming school integration was a states' rights issue. The Alabama State Senate and the Virginia legislature even passed resolutions attempting to nullify the decision. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus argued that the federal government was merely a creation of the states and that the states had to defend their rights or risk losing them. In Virginia, Senator Harry F. Byrd called for massive resistance to federal integration efforts, and Mississippi Senator James Eastland, an open racist whose father had lynched a black couple, claimed that black Americans had not initiated the push for integration but were being manipulated by radical busybodies trying to undermine American society, and even suggested that the communists were behind the Brown decision. Opposition to integration spread through white citizens' councils, middle-class versions of the KKK, which eventually grew to 250,000 members. These groups used economic pressure to punish black individuals who challenged segregation, and in many areas, joining a citizens' council was almost required for white politicians seeking office. In 1956, more than 100 members of Congress signed the Southern Manifesto, a document condemning the Brown v. Board as an abuse of judicial power that created a dangerous situation in the South. Only 3 Southern Democrats refused to sign it, one of whom was Lyndon B. Johnson, who would become president in 1963. Southern resistance to integration was highly effective, and 2 years after Brown, not a single black student attended a white school in 6 southern states, and by 1960, only 765 out of 6,676 southern school districts had begun desegregation. In addition to inspiring white resistance, the Brown case also encouraged many black Americans and white activists, signaling that the federal government might finally be confronting racial discrimination. However, while the NAACP and the courts played a major role in the civil rights movement, individual black Americans who took personal risks to challenge segregation often didn't receive as much attention for their brave contributions. One of the most notable examples of individual defiance came from Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama on December 1st, 1955. Parks was a 42-year-old seamstress and seasoned activist for racial justice who boarded a bus on Cleveland Avenue and sat in the third row, a section that was designated for white passengers only. When the white passengers boarded, the driver, James Blake, ordered Parks to move to the back of the bus, as was required by local segregation laws. Parks refused to give up her seat. Blake then demanded, "Why don't you stand up?" To which Parks calmly responded, "I don't think I should have to stand up." Blake insisted, telling her that black individuals had to move or she would be arrested. Parks quietly replied, "You may do that." She was tired of giving in, as she later explained, feeling that she had been pushed as far as she could possibly stand to be pushed, and her arrest sparked an enormous reaction. That very night, Joanne Robinson, an English professor at Alabama State College, would print and distribute 50,000 flyers across Montgomery, urging people to boycott the bus system. The flyer read, "Another Negro woman has been arrested and thrown into jail because she refused to get up out of her seat on the bus for a white person to sit down. Don't ride the buses." The following night, black leaders in the community, including Martin Luther King Jr., gathered at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church to formally organize the boycott. Since many bus riders were African Americans, the boycott quickly gained momentum, becoming a powerful symbol of resistance and marking the beginning of a new phase in the civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott. This act of courage by Parks and the community's immediate response sparked one of the most important protests in the fight for racial equality in America. So if we were to try and answer this question, we might say Eisenhower's reluctance to take strong action on civil rights due to his preference for state control and his doubts about laws changing racist attitudes allowed segregation to persist. Although he supported civil rights in principle, he avoided making it a central issue and didn't enforce the Supreme Court's rulings. So in the Montgomery bus boycott, a 26-year-old pastor by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. would emerge as a brave and inspiring leader. King, the grandson of an enslaved person and the son of a prominent minister, was an eloquent speaker, and he urged his followers to use the weapon of love and emphasized that many people are taught to hate, which diminishes their responsibility for it. To his opponents, King said, "We will soon wear you down by our capacity to suffer, and in winning our freedom, we will appeal to your heart and conscience." He strongly believed in nonviolent civil disobedience, challenging unjust laws through peaceful actions. However, he also understood that without confrontation, progress would be impossible. The Montgomery bus boycott was a remarkable success. For 381 days, African Americans organized carpools, used black-owned taxis, hitched rides, or simply walked to avoid riding segregated buses. Even some white supporters joined in, offering rides, and this mass protest angered many whites, leading to harassment and violence against black participants. And the KKK even bombed black churches and homes, and despite all that violence, King urged his followers to remain calm and nonviolent, telling them, "Don't get panicky, don't get your weapons, we want to love our enemies." King himself was arrested twice during the period of the boycott, and it ultimately led to a victory. On December 20th, 1956, the boycotters won a federal case against bus segregation, and the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. The next day, King and other activists rode the buses, demonstrating the power of nonviolent resistance, and the boycott not only brought about change, but also launched King into the national spotlight. As for Rosa Parks, she and her husband faced severe consequences. They lost their jobs, received death threats, and their house was bombed. And after 8 months of harassment, they moved to Detroit, but continued to support the civil rights movement. Park famously said, "Freedom fighters never retired." In 1957, congressional leaders, hoping to gain political advantage by exploiting divisions between Northern and Southern Democrats and to win back some of the black vote for Republicans, worked to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The law was the first civil rights legislation since 1875 and passed after a year's delay. Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson, a Democrat from Texas, played a key role in getting the bill through Congress, as Johnson, knowing that his future political career, especially aspirations to become president, depended on shedding the image of a racist Southern politician, worked to secure support from both Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans. The bill aimed to protect voting rights for all Americans, regardless of race or ethnicity, and to gain Southern support, Johnson had to weaken the bill's enforcement provisions, which ultimately limited its effectiveness, and the Civil Rights Act created the Civil Rights Commission and established a new civil rights division within the Justice Department to protect voting rights. However, despite this landmark legislation, by 1959 it had failed to significantly impact voter registration. In fact, not a single black voter in the South had been added to the rolls, and this revealed how limited the law's impact was in addressing racial discrimination in voting at the time. All right, so a few weeks after the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was passed, Arkansas Governor Orville Eugene Faubus, a staunch segregationist, called a special session of the state legislature, urging them to pass bills that would allow him to close public schools facing integration and divert funding from those schools to private segregation academies. In the fall of 1957, Faubus defied a federal court order by using the state National Guard to prevent 9 black students from enrolling at Little Rock's Central High School. When one of the students, Elizabeth Eckford, tried to enter, the National Guard blocked her, and she was then confronted by a mob of white people shouting threats. Despite the hostile crowd, she continued walking, but was spat on and taunted. The mayor of Little Rock urged President Eisenhower to send federal troops to protect the students, and Eisenhower sent 1,000 Army paratroopers, marking the first time since the 1870s that federal troops had been sent to the South to protect African Americans. The troops used bayonets to disperse the crowd and escorted the students into the school, where soldiers stayed to protect them throughout the year. Southern politicians lashed out at Eisenhower, accusing him of violating states' rights and igniting hatred. Eisenhower, however, emphasized that his decision was about upholding law and order and not about the issue of integration. He believed in maintaining the rule of law with the Supreme Court as the final authority. And in the summer of 1958, Governor Faubus closed Little Rock's public schools rather than integrate them, and other southern states followed suit. This led to continued resistance in some southern states, particularly in the lower South, as Faubus served as governor of Arkansas for 6 terms despite these actions. All right, so the growing sense of disappointment in the civil rights movement only made Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent approach stand out more, as King explained that with blasted hopes and deep disappointment, the black community had no choice but to prepare for direct action using their own bodies to present their case to the nation's conscience. On January 10, 1957, King brought together 60 black ministers and leaders at Ebenezer Church in Atlanta. Their goal was to form an organization that would promote nonviolent civil disobedience to desegregate bus systems in the South. This led to the creation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, with King as its president, and unlike the NAACP, which focused on individual membership, the SCLC coordinated activities on behalf of churches and community groups, and at first many black ministers were reluctant to join, fearing a backlash from white communities, but King's persistence eventually helped the SCLC grow into a powerful organization. Activists knew that violence would likely follow their actions. As Roy Wilkins, leader of the NAACP, said, "The Negro citizen has come to the point where he is not afraid of violence. He no longer shrinks back." And this marked the second phase of the civil rights movement, which would gain momentum in the 1960s as activists resisted injustice with love and the strength to endure opposition, often without support from the president. John Lewis, another prominent civil rights leader, emphasized that the movement was built on strong religious faith. Activists often asked, "What would Jesus do?" as they worked to determine their next steps in the struggle for equality.